Welcome to Divcasts from University of Chicago Divinity School. For more of our podcasts and information about our terms of use, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts.
So I think I'll go ahead and convene us. Welcome to the Winter Dean's Craft of Teaching Seminar. I'll turn it over to Dean Mitchell in a moment to introduce our guests for today. I have a few announcements. First of all, remember to sign in if you want credit for attending today. You can also do so after the workshop. If you RSVP, there are lunches available for you. There's also coffee and drinks. And feel free, we'll be informal, so if you want to refill your coffee during the workshop seminar. And I'm also going to pass around, if you do not have hard copies, I have a limited number available of Professor Furey's course materials. So if you didn't have a chance to print one out, you can do that. Or you can share also, because I don't know about 10% of those available. I will be announcing the spring schedule of events, which I'm really excited about, shortly in the next week or two, but I want to preview a couple of events that I'm especially excited about. On Friday, May 9th, we will have a full-day dissertation writing and professional development workshop. The emphasis will be on dissertation writing, on developing sound writing habits and practices as graduate students, on overcoming the psychological barriers that we all face to writing dissertations and academic writing, and to how to approach your writing and your teaching and still try to maintain some semblance of a life as well. So we'll be bringing in Dr. Peg Boyle-Single, who is a social psychologist and author of Demystifying Dissertation Writing. And she has over 15 years experience working with graduate students and with young faculty members, helping them to overcome their writing and their teaching prep struggles. So it's a full-day event. We'll have a morning workshop, an afternoon workshop, lunch in between. There'll be ample time for you to consult with Dr. Single about whatever particular struggles that you're facing in your own writing and your own teaching prep. So it's an event you won't want to miss. Advanced registration will be required. It's completely open. There's no cap on registration, but we do need a number in terms of who will be there. So that will be Friday, May 9th. So look out for RSVP information for that. Another event that I'm also ecstatic about is another one-day workshop on reacting to the past pedagogy. I don't know how many of you have heard about reacting to the past. Reacting is an exciting kind of interactive approach to teaching of classic text, classic primary text, and it uses elaborate role-playing simulations to teach text, ideas, critical moments in history of thought. So imagine transforming your classroom for 8 weeks into the Council of Nicaea, for instance, or the Reformation Parliament under Henry VIII, or Athens after the Peloponnesian War. So where students are actually immersing themselves in assuming personae, immersing themselves in primary text, doing all the things we want them to do, engaging in critical thinking, debating, developing arguments, public speaking, all the skill development that we're looking for in our teaching. So, and if really the best way, I have it on a good authority from Debbie Green, who's a UC alum who uses reacting in her teaching. The best way to learn how to do it in your classes is to actually do it yourself and experience it as a student. And that's what we're going to be doing on May 31st. So we'll have a one-day full running of a game for simulation, and we'll talk about the pedagogical rationale behind it. And even if you don't adopt reacting as a model, it will hopefully inspire creative pedagogies and creative approaches in your own teaching. So that'll be Saturday, May 31st, and we do have to cap registration on that. So if you are interested, please RSVP early for that. And one final event I just want to put on your radar, because it'll be our first event of the spring on April 14th. Michael Petrus, who's a staff psychologist at Student Counseling on campus, will be coming and doing an event with us, Students in Distress, Student Mental Health in Today's College Teaching. And did you know that the rate of college students seeking services at campus, counseling services for acute mental health issues has doubled in the last decade? So the teaching context that we are facing is very different than when we were undergraduates. So Dr. Petrus will talk about this, what it means for our teaching and our approaches to our pedagogy. So that will be on April 14th. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dean Mitchell.
Thank you, Brandon. Before I introduce Professor Furey, I do want to take this opportunity to thank Brandon for incredibly visionary, imaginative, and competent leadership of our program, the professionalism of the program, the reach and range of opportunities that we have. The numbers of people here today who both heard about this, got interested, has been just superior. So could I ask for a round of applause? It's a real pleasure to welcome back to this hall Professor Constance Furey. Professor Furey is Associate Professor and Associate Department Chair in the Department of Religious Studies at Indiana University, one of the really top departments for the study of religion in the country. At least one alumna from that program is here today. And a fair number of Chicago folks are at IU. It's a really great department, and it's wonderful to...
We just hired another one. Someone said to me recently, are you ever going to hire someone who's not from the university?
That's good. So, I don't know if some of you know that Cooper Harris will be joining the faculty of Indiana University next year. Really excited about that. And I guess I should also say in return that Professor Richard Miller from the Religion Department at Indiana University will be joining the Divinity School faculty in July 1, 2014 as Professor of Religious Ethics. So
it's a sign of how much I love the University of Chicago, but I still came because of it.
Even though we pulled this away. But this is one of many really great contacts we have with your department. Professor Furey holds the BA degree from Brown University and the PhD in History of Christianity from the University of Chicago Divinity School. Her first book was entitled Erasmus, Contarini, and the Religious Republic of Letters, published by Cambridge University Press. And she's currently engaged in a book project entitled Crowded Interiors, Sacred Selves and Relationships in English Renaissance Poetry. She's well known to us as a scholar of Renaissance and Reformation Christianity. She is also very well known at Indiana University for the superiority of her teaching. She has won the university's Trustees Teaching Award twice, in 2004 and 2009. The session this afternoon, as you know, is centered both on the analysis of the context where Professor Furey teaches and how she negotiates that context in her work, and a focus on two courses, Sex and Gender in the Reformation, Prophecy, Celibacy, Mysticism, and Witchcraft. And then the second is Bibles, Bodies, and Religious Reform, all of which have been pre-distributed to you. So before we begin our conversation, just two quick things. One is a warm welcome to Professor Furey. And the second is, in order to set up for our conversation, I think it would be helpful if everyone around the table would just briefly introduce themselves by degree program, unit at the university, and anything else quickly relevant to this.
Right. Maybe a quick relevant thing would just be one teaching experience you've had. So that I have a sense of your range.
Please.
My name is Michelle Young. I'm a master's student, second quarter. I worked as a substitute teacher and a counselor, so I have experience teaching a couple different years.
I'm Jason Hattler. I'm a mid-year PhD in philosophy, and I'm actually currently teaching a course at St. Xavier University in Formal Logic and Argument.
My name is Gerald Ferguson. I'm a PhD in ethics here at Divinity School, and I have a little bit of experience teaching.
My name is Mary Milska. I'm a third year in History of Judaism. I've been a TA for the Intro to Religion course here, and I'm looking forward to more.
I'm Kim Ringel. I'm married, so I'm a third year PhD student in theology. I'm currently a TA for early learning philosophy class, and this is my 6th year of teaching.
Joy Brennan, Philosophy of Religions. I've taught in the Hume Corps here at the university. I'm Kelly Gardner. I'm a third-year PhD student in Hebrew Bible, and I've TA'd the Introductory Bible last quarter. My name's Allison Gray. I'm a PhD student in New Testament Early Christian Literature, and I've taught several Intro to Bible courses at Dominican University.
I'm Francesca Chubcon. I'm a first-year PhD student in Islamic Studies, and I don't have any teaching experience yet, but I do.
I'm Tim Bushman, third year in Islamic Studies. I taught Chinese history in college.
I'm Evan Keaton, I'm a fourth year PhD student in theology, and I've been TAing in the Humanities School.
I'm Mary Emily Duba, and a PhD student in the theology program, and I'm teaching in the Writing Center here now, and then I also teach occasionally at Lake Forest College.
Is it still Little Restful House?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
I'm Willow Angel, and I'm a PhD in religious ethics, and I have TA'd part-time religious school, so for master's students.
My name is Robert Corwell, and I'm in history of Christianity, and I taught for a year full-time as a high school teacher. I taught 5 courses in adjunct, and I've got a lot of tutoring.
My name is Dan Yingst, and I'm a fifth-year PhD in history of Christianity, and I just finished the very last session of my first TA job in the history of Christianity, history of Christian Part 2 course.
So for master students?
Mostly, yeah.
I'm Matthew Vanderpool in history of Christianity, and I've taught church history in kind of overseas secondary school settings.
I'm James Covington. I'm a first-year PhD student in Bible, and I taught undergraduates and adults in denominational contexts.
I'm Andrew Lankard, and I'm a 5th year in New Testament Early Christian Literature, and most recently I've been TAing the introductory coinage Greek class.
My name is Elsa Marty. I'm a first-year PhD student in theology, and I've done a little bit of teaching at a seminary in India.
My name is Barnabas Kusur. I'm a PhD student in theology. I haven't had any teaching experience yet.
My name is Bryce Ridge. I'm in theology, and with Dan, I just finished my first THF here in History of Christian Thought.
My name is Rick O'Gany. I'm also in theology. I teach at Lake Forest College classes in philosophy of religion.
My name is Emil Windra. I'm the first year in the philosophy of religions program here. The only TAing I've done was freshman calculus about 10 years ago. I'm hoping to start TAing in humanities next year.
I'm Lisa Landon-Hudrick. I'm a second year PhD in theology, and I haven't taught at Divinity School yet, but in college I tutored first language.
I'm Jason Lee. I'm a visiting scholar from China, and I'm really teach Western political thought in our university.
My name is Garrett Campbell. I'm a PhD student in history of Christianity, and I've been teaching writing pedagogy so far.
I'm Mary Jacobson-Beck, and I'm a second year Islamic Studies PhD, and I haven't taught here, but I was a teaching assistant at Yale for philosophy, psychology course.
I'm Shakila, PhD candidate in Anthropology and Sociology of Religion. I TA'd the Introduction to the Studies course last year, and I also co-taught the class in history again last year.
I'm Professor Furey. I've been teaching since the earth is flat. And I'm proud to say that Professor Furey is one of my former students.
I'm R.L. Watson. I'm a 4th year in the Religion and Literature program here. I have served as a writing intern in the Humanities Corps. I was writing tutor while I was at Yale Divinity, so mostly master's students. And I also taught technical theater.
Technical theater? So thank you all. There's a couple things to thank you for having me here. Thank you all. Thank you for organizing it. This is a really exciting thing in part. Just going to talk to Brandon a little bit before this began about the work that you all have done to create this series. And it gives me a lot of ideas to take back to Indiana with me because as it's true here at Chicago, we need to be thinking more and more about how to prepare our graduate students to teach. it's an interesting thing about preparing graduate students to teach, and I'll say a little bit about the experiences I did have in teaching here, because I did have some. The first was students and spearheaded when I was here, and spearheaded some teaching experience, some teaching opportunities that were new at the time when I came. So I graduated in 2000, so I think starting around 1996, a few programs were put in place, and I was part of them. But I think also it's always interesting now, when I'm sitting on the other side of the table. We, for example, just had a kind of brown bag lunch with our graduate students to ask them what kinds of training we could offer them that would better prepare them. And there is a sense in which, as a professor, you often, most of us, and so I've been 14 years I've been a professor, and so in my time, in my career, this is true for me and almost everyone older than I am, that our sense is, the profession's mostly about someone throws you into the pool and asks you to swim. And it's wonderful to think about how to train people in teaching, and I'm very invested in that, just in the same way that I'm invested in teaching. I mean, it's all part of, in some ways, a continuum. How to teach students, how to teach other teachers, how we teach ourselves, how it is we engage as intellectuals and academics in discussion. I think those are not separable things. They're all part of the same thing. So in that sense, I'm very, very interested in it. But and of course, there's always that sense that back in the day, no one told us. So my back in the day is that, for example, although I had some wonderful teaching experience at St. Xavier, one class, a small class, 30 students, and I had taught more little at Schoolhouse. So those were my two teaching things I did. And Marty had done a sort of teaching colloquium, I think, that we basically, each of us gave one lecture. So I think there were about 12 of us in a class, and I don't think it was a full credit class. I remember it just taking place over several weeks. And each of us gave a lecture, and then we get feedback from other students about that lecture. So that was my teaching experience. So it's significant back in the time when there weren't people generally doing Zoom courses, for example, and there weren't that many AI opportunities. Although I think there's some. I didn't do that, and we didn't have an undergraduate program at that point. But so those are all the differences. So I got my job at Indiana University, and I graduated on Saturday in August, and on Monday I walked into my first graduate seminar. And my other course was actually a very early version of the Bible and Body course with just 25 students. And then in January I walked into my first course of 180 students and lectured to that number of students. And I never, as an undergraduate at Brown, I mostly avoided lecture classes, and here, of course, classes are smaller. So I not only had never taught 180 students, I'd never been in a room with 180 students, except for some other kind of lecture. So there is a sense in which this career is about doing things that no one really exactly can train you to do. And there is a way in which you are always flying blind to some extent. And that you can either find that to be a very frustrating thing and sort of try to find ways to minimize that feeling of confusion and frustration, or you can find that an opportunity for experimentation and a kind of playful excitement about how every time you walk into a classroom, every time you create a class, you are, in a sense, experimenting. And that is part of, I think, the pleasure of intellectual life. You're always, that's what we do in our thinking. We try out ideas, we think how they work, we try to find a way to communicate them. If it fails, we try again, we reformulate. And in a sense, that's what you're doing in a classroom. So I think this is extraordinary. I will go back and comb through the website, and there's just telegram all the various things that you use describing in terms of techniques that I will think about trying to find ways to institute at Indiana for our graduate student. But I do want to say there's a way in which one thing you want to know is the reason you never feel prepared enough is because you'll never be prepared enough. And that's true at every stage of your career. So, for better or for worse. I think, and I want to make for better. So let me say a little bit more about my context besides having just told you. So you know from my description of my first year. So I teach generally a 2-2 load, Generally, most people teach one graduate course per year, a couple of mid-level courses, and one large course. The size of those courses does vary. For example, one thing that's significantly changed structurally in our institution in the last 5 years or so is these new gen ed requirements and the sort of certain number of classes that the college designates kind of topics types classes, so you can teach fewer students and get the same amount of AI support. So, for example, my large class this semester is 60 people, and the college caps those at 60 and 120. And we don't have any choice in that. That's something the college sets. The reason I mention that is because enrollment pressure is always a line of concern for us. So for me to be teaching a class of 60 means I'm not teaching a class of 140 or 150, which is where our bigger classes top out now. And that's to tell you also that that's a change in my 15 years. That when I first came as an unknown professor teaching Intro to Christianity, I could get 180 students in the class because of the title Intro to Christianity. Now, here 15 years later, because of changes in enrollment patterns, changes in majors, as we all know, some changes in the popularity of humanities disciplines, I think actually becoming really in some ways more significantly, I want to avoid language of crisis, but I'll just go ahead and say acute. Even in the last couple of years, numbers of majors have talked now to people from 5 or 6 different kinds of institutions just in the last, who all nod when I say, well, actually a lot of the humanities departments that I do have just in the last couple of years had a pretty significant drop in enrollments. And they all say, yep, that's actually the last couple of years. So I assume somebody's doing great work to tell us why this is the moment that I have to that work. So I look forward to other people telling me about that. So I mentioned that because enrollment pressures, I mentioned numbers because, of course, working at IU, but I think in most places, most of you will work, enrollments are going to be a question. So in other words, doing courses, more and more, it's the assumption that you're going to be doing a course where the title alone won't carry you, or if the title carries you, or the title won't carry you, the gen ed requirement might. General education requirement is what I mean. By that I mean it's a requirement, so the distribution requirements that students, regardless of what school they might be in, say business school or school of public policy or something like that, might still have to take a certain number of these courses, even if they don't major in the humanities discipline. So that's one thing to say about the kind of my context. And the other thing that was implicit in what I just said is that the question of what courses will attract interest has changed. I do think that tradition-based courses, the assumption that we can imagine that Intro to Christianity, Intro to Islam, Intro to Judaism, that title is itself super intriguing to students, is not as true as it was when I started 15 years ago. Now, it's also true, we're a little bit caught, and this is something we think about a lot in our department, after you have enrollment pressures, we are a little bit caught because thematic titles like Bible and Body, which we want to, of course, I put in Reformation, but if I call it Bible and Body, potentially interesting, obviously my other course title, Sex and Gender, right? Obviously I'm trying to do some of those key words. On the other hand, if it's a little bit perplexing in title, if it's not clear what you're going to learn, then also you have to, I'm saying you as a student, if the students aren't clear what they're going to learn in that course, then there's a potential for them to think, I don't have time. I have a deadload. I have requirements to meet. I don't have time to be intrigued by what I'm going to learn in a Bible and Body course. So that it's not, I don't think we're at a moment where it's so clear, like, oh, well, just do super interesting thematic courses. That'll get them in there. Or, no, just do the tradition. They just want to know the basics about the tradition so they can be good citizens of the world. Or because they're struggling in some way with their own, either wanting to know more about their own tradition or frustrated by their own tradition. Neither of those things are, I believe, in my own sense of things and talking to other people, are as true as they were. The latter being the appeal of the clear topics course, clearly labeled tradition course is not as clear as it was, but we are not in a time when experimentation and excitement about strangeness and novelty is going to carry the day either. So that's an interesting thing. I'm going to spend most of the rest of the time talking much more specifically about the courses, but I just wanted to make sure to give you all a sense of that broader institutional thing, because more so as an associate. As an assistant professor, you won't face those kinds of issues. Hopefully you'll be in a kind of department that's shielding you somewhat from having to think institutionally in quite the way I just described. But you will certainly be, your lives will be influenced by those kinds of issues. And certainly when you're thinking about being in the job market and in the job and talking about the kind of course you're going to offer and the way the kind of responses you're going to get, obviously, from your hopefully future colleagues, is going to be reflecting their own sense of things along the line. They might have a different sense than I just gave you, but they will be thinking about those same questions. They may come to different conclusions than I did, but that's the kinds of issues they'll be thinking about. So the students that I teach, so that has changed, as I say, over the past 15 years. In part, in some ways, the quality of students has gone up at Indiana University in the past 15 years. Let's say if we were to gauge that in terms of test scores. Now that has to do in part with the pressures on public universities. And that has to do with the declining amount of state support is, of course, the line is the decline, state support declines, tuition has raised, and the need to get out-of-state students has gone up dramatically. So with the more out-of-state students, you can have a higher standard for test scores. So in that sense, our students are, in some ways, come more prepared in the way that test prep prepares students to be in college. That means also that they are sometimes have been educational context where experimentation or just the intellectual playfulness has been valued or prioritized, and that's something that I've seen. The other thing is, already when I came, people like to tell horror stories about, you're going to be an intro to Christianity, which was the 180-person course I was teaching that second semester. You're going to be in there and you're going to be telling them something about early Christianity, and you're going to have your Bible thumper in the front row, and that person's going to stand up and they're going to proof text you. Never happened. I never had anyone do that to me, and I do think that's a change. I think it's Mary Jo Weaver is a really great scholar, modern Catholicism, who taught alongside each other for a while. I wasn't her successor, but she had gone through those kinds of experiences. But already when I started teaching, people had some sense of, I think, frustration with the polarization of religious discourse. Students have some frustration. They're much more inclined to, can't we all just get along? And they might hold their own convictions quite dear to their heart, but they have, I haven't had to spend a significant amount of time in the classroom saying, okay, here we are, academic discussion about religion. How is that different than being religious? I'm not saying that is something we're negotiating all the time. Margie and I are talking when she extended this invitation about the great piece she wrote in the Criterion, thank you, about everyone who's walking the halls or all your students are likely to have a complicated relationship to religion, and I don't need to minimize that. That's something you always have to be. That's the excitement and the fun of teaching in religious studies, is you have some sense that there's something at stake, and you have some sense that most of your students will think there's something at stake. And that's great. You can use that. That is something to embrace rather than to run from. That is something you want to bring in some way into the classroom rather than exclude from the classroom. Now, when I say that, I don't believe, in my own sense of it, has been, I don't find it most useful to set up strict guidelines of the kind of speech that's allowed and the kind of speech that's disallowed. I think, as with many things, that modeling that is more useful than imposing that. And you model it in a couple of different ways. Obviously, you model it by the way you do it. You model it in a way that you respond to student statements that are entirely faith-based, meaning where they have chosen not to, where they proclaim that they will not engage the material because they know that this other thing is true because it is what they believe. And then you can adapt in those moments. That's an interesting opportunity to have discussions about what kind of conversation that curtails and what kind of conversation that enables. And that's the way I usually handle that. In other words, if you say that you know this because you believe it, what ways are the other people in the class going to be able to now engage with you about that? So that would be an example, just a small example. There are religious people who come with that way of speaking. I don't find that to be primary teaching issue that I face, but it does happen, and that's what I handle when it does. But so in general, though, as I said, there's much more of a sense that the premium on tolerance and diversity is high, and so the assumption that, okay, I'm going to learn about something, maybe it's my thing, but it might not be that person's thing, and I understand that I'm in the classroom doing that, learning, and so that's sort of the difficulty then with an assumption of tolerance is, so they're in religion, so there's some sense they know it matters, there's a strong belief that kind of, lots of people believe lots of different things, and who can really say? And that's, of course, not a useful stance for getting people to engage in a significant, dig into material. So that's something that you have to struggle with. We can talk a little bit about that in terms of the specific course design that I do. All right, so I think that I invite questions from you all about context. In fact, maybe we could stop. Do you all have any questions about context, what it means to teach in a place like Indiana University, a public university, what it means to teach large courses? And so we can take a moment to see if I need to fill in anything else about context, and then I'll turn to the specifics of the course design. Yes, Susan.
As you know, I taught at Arizona University before I came in.
Yes.
And of course that was, we won't even talk about what year that was, but I did have a few Bible thumpers in the front row.
Right.
But they were nice to me because they gave me an honors course, so I didn't worry about that too much. But one thing I found more challenging than the Bible thumpers, which I think is a question of tolerance. Also, you tolerate people who are evangelical or fundamentalists, just like you tolerate any other form.
Right, or you invite them into the conversation. If they're totally unwilling to have a conversation, then you've got a problem.
Was religious illiteracy was the bigger problem. That, if you want the history of this, it really began in the 60s when my generation stopped believing in denominational affiliations or stopped going to church, and so their children did not grow. I once remember telling a class who was glossed on something. It's not that you're idiots; it's that you have not been exposed.
Right. But this is not that you're idiots. No, they've grown up in a culture without a religious vocabulary. I'm just trying to imagine the question that required that response. Are we idiots?
It was somebody who wanted to know what the fall was.
Right. Oh, exactly. I had someone in my class, I'm teaching an original sin class right now, and I had someone finally, and was, a couple of weeks in. And
what is it?
The fall. Yeah, keep saying. But Susan, this is an interesting, I think this is helpful because it speaks to a biographical issue that explains why I didn't start with the point about religious literacy. In some ways it's invisible, I assume it.
Yeah, you have to assume it.
It's an assumption I didn't even make conscious.
On an undergraduate level.
But it's also true that I was fairly religiously illiterate, so my whole experience of it, and I'm thinking about you teaching the Reformation, was just day after day of discovery. Like, who knew? And it's so my God, it's so profound, those debates. I had no idea people were doing that. Right? So in some sense, for me, that's a helpful, I'm okay with that starting point in a way, because it then is potentially the continual thrill of discovery. Which is, of course, I take the point, because it's true, I felt horrible. Actually, I didn't realize it wasn't my original sin class. It was actually the sex and gender class, because we didn't do the fall explicitly on this class. And no, we did. I'm sorry, we did. We did Genesis, but we had been talking about it before, and then there was a moment where somebody, after series, clearly having felt silenced for a while and like an idiot for a while, and finally asked the question. So then, there is definitely a sense as a teacher, you're always struggling. How far back do I need to go?
You just can't assume.
You can't assume anything, but you also can't teach a course where you are constantly thinking about, I can't assume anything, because that's infinite regress in a sense. And so that's a tricky issue, and I think that's something that you really, again, my usual mode is to assume not a tremendous amount of, I need to redesign this course so that I define it all from the first day, but wonderful that there was a context and an atmosphere in which the person could ask.
One way to do it is to ask, okay, does anybody not know what polytheism is? And no one's going to actually raise their hand.
Right,
But
exactly.
look for confused faces. Look for a person who's like, and then you just go on and explain.
Yes,
without
that's
making
perfect.
someone admit I'm an idiot. You know?
Yeah, that is absolutely a great, and I think it's also very helpful to create one of the assignments that or one thing I do in my course structures is almost, including my large courses, though often AIs are leading the bulk of these, is pre-class postings. So that's something that happens, and we have on an online thing, what do you call it? A thing called an on-course. And that's where students can post, and other students can see their posts, and I'll describe in more detail the requirements for that post. But that kind of thing, creating some context for them to highlight or flag something they want to understand.
Yeah, I'd like to comment. I was invited to teach in one of Professor Furey's classes, and I could not believe how prepared everybody was. And I knew it wasn't me.
Well, I didn't. No, it was they were especially prepared because I told them I couldn't prepare.
It was the online stuff that I think was most important. That you put online questions they were to think about, or were they corresponding with each other?
They have to. Well, yeah, they did some courses. That is, I think, and I maybe
that was
this is I recommend this is my takeaway. Is I do think that pre-class posting is something that works well, and I think there's two things that I do that make that. The two things that are very good about it is they are required to quote something specific from the text. So in the first few weeks, that means that there's often you're saying really fascinating, thoughtful comments. You didn't give me a quote. So I'm just actually rigid about that. There actually has to be a quote. That is a kind of over the top, I'm trying to model, I'm trying to impose the process of being in conversation with the text. And the way that I've done that structurally is that the assignment requires you to quote and then say something that was interesting, confusing, surprising about the quote.
It really did work.
It worked
in a phenomenal way. I've never been in a class that did that.
That's so true. And the other thing that was great about what that does is, have you all heard of people still using this phrase, just-in-time teaching? Still using it a little bit. So I don't really do just-in-time teaching. But that is a little. So I require them to post by the evening before the class. So let's say if I'm teaching at 9:30, they have to post by 9 p.m. So I have an hour and a half in the morning, part of my prep to look at it. If I'm teaching later in the day, they might. In any case, it's gauged in terms of when my start time is, so that I've given myself a little bit of prep time where I can skim through those questions. The reason it's not just in time teaching is I do not structure my entire class around what they've said, but I walk in very clear on the range of things they've said. Now, in a large class where my AIs are reading the bulk of those, because one other takeaway you should get from this is you should also, in most of the context that most of you will be teaching in, you should also be thinking about efficiency. You cannot spend all of your time doing the wonderful things that you could imagine a great pedagogue would do. And you just can't. So you cannot, for example, set yourself up in a situation where you do careful grading of an assignment that every person in the class completes every class. It's too much work. You can do so that, for example, with those postings, they are essentially an automatic. If they've got if they've got the quotation marks, parenthetical page number, period, and some questions, it's an automatic. I want you all, as you're listening and thinking about teaching techniques and strategies and all those things, you have to keep in mind that teaching is only one of the things you're doing. And that insofar as there's a sense that an ideal is being set up that you need to try to attain, you have to recognize you will not attain it, and to try to attain it in a way that is highly labor intensive is going to work against you against your successes as a scholar in some significant ways. So that is something I just want to make sure people are also keeping in mind. Because I think often when we gather like this and I sort of show you things that work, okay, very good, let's try to do that. It's very easy to have it become something that you put too much on yourself, make it labor intensive. Yeah.
But on just this point, it sounded a minute ago like you were saying you do respond to their postings.
So, great. So the postings, they get an automatic grade. And what I was about to say with a large class, the AIs will give me a summary of a sampling. So that's the way in which I save myself in the large class from having to read all of them. In the significantly smaller classes, by which I mean actually 20 and smaller, which the very upper level classes can be that small that I do. The mid-level classes are usually capped now at about 30 or 35. that I wouldn't set myself a requirement. I would, first of all, divide it up, so half the class post before, if the class meets twice a week, which is now the norm in most places at IU for our kinds of classes. Again, I know all the pressure, it's hard to get students to sign up for classes that are 3 days a week. Mm-hmm. And that's been very dramatically on the institution figure in, because that's just cultures of enrollment. And in IU, it's become a culture of enrollment where Fridays, people will show up for sections. If they're diligent, but they will not sign, unless they're first semester freshmen, they will not sign up for classes, certainly not after the November. Anyway, so I divide up, for the smaller classes, I would divide a half post before one class, half post before the other. And I will usually give a one sentence response, but it's the kind or maybe I give longer. But practice, I got 10 minutes, and I gave myself a little bit of extra time to care about teaching, but I wouldn't advise, those are the kinds of things I don't advise starting level teachers to ask themselves to be giving careful, thoughtful responses if they have regular assignments from students. Yeah.
I was wondering about struggles with uninterested non-majors that kind of comes up with the core requirements. Just because, especially like at this university, I feel like it's unique where you can have a physics major who's really interested in the humanities or something. But even here, I felt like people were just checked out for our classes. So how does that come up? I imagine it's different when it's a huge room where you don't get to know everyone personally in the same way.
Right.
How do you deal with that?
Yeah. So, for example, right now, the original same class, I'm teaching the topics class, so there's there's one person there who's a religious studies major. Almost half of the students about a third actually are psychosociology, a third are sciences, and the other third are sampling of other things. And I have also several football players and other athletes. And so that's a fairly small room in a way, 60 people. I can get to them all. So I'm fairly interactive in my teaching, and so in that case I do two ways to answer this question. One, in terms of, you want to be clear why this material is interesting. You want to know what the stakes are, and you want to be able to talk about the stakes. So, original sin, what's at stake? There's an implicit theory of human nature behind many social institutions. If you all come from schools, for example, schools are structured in a way that are making assumptions about what motivates people, why people show up, why they do what they do. So I'm going to talk to you about this doctrine, this Christian doctrine, this long history of Christian doctrine. But there's going to be ways that I am going to be thinking whenever I'm presenting any part of the adjustment relations debate. Marxism is, brilliant at this. You don't necessarily have to do it by doing a current example. You don't have to relate it to today, although you were brilliant at this. I think actually like the certainty stuff and the thin blue line, of course, death penalty and the question of certainty and the way in which it's related to our, assumptions we make about certainty and public policy issues today. So those I think that Susan was a real model for me on those kinds of things, relating to modern question, relating to relevant issues today. But I don't mean in the sense that you have to have pop culture references. Zero. Sometimes I'll trot one out just so the students can laugh at me a little bit. That's a good little humor. Like a little, I tried to describe someone using Instagram the other day, and finally they said, "You need Snapchat." I've never seen either, so I don't know. But that was my pop culture reference. So you don't need to use pop culture references. What I mean is intellectually you need to convey that they are already in some way engaged with this question. The question is, intellectually they're engaged with it. They are not talking about it, or we'll say how else is often they actually are, or predestination. Predestination. Yeah, that was like getting it out of the park. So that's one thing. But I do, I set it up the structure so that they can't get through the class without having engagement most of this. They have to go past their eyes over the text. I call on people, I cold call. That's just, it's just fairly interactive when I'm there. So, in fact, this is one of those moments we'll edit out. Yesterday, we actually had a nice spring day on Tuesday, and we were talking about Rousseau's Emile, sort of talking about a counterpart to sort of an assumption of original sin. And in my class, and we were using the example of the impulse to want to go outside rather than being in the class, and there was a student, and I said, at some point, he's gazing out the window. So here I've been talking, I had been making this accessible, right? We've been talking about how they want to be outside the class instead of in the class, and I had a good student, his name was Nick, and he was great, and he's mostly engaged, and he was staring out the window, and I said, so Nick, what would, so what do you think Rousseau would say about the impulse? And he said, shit. I'd probably say you should pay attention to class, which actually Rousseau probably would not say. So that was interesting. And so there's a way in which I don't think it's okay for people in the back half of the room to be falling asleep or not engaged. And that's my strength and my weakness as a teacher. It does mean that actually the people in the front half of the room who are there prepared. They had to go through that moment where I was trying to make sure that back quarter of the room was paying attention. And they're thinking, I was here, I have underlinings on page 10 we haven't talked about yet. And, that's, so of decisions you all have to make about yourselves as teachers, that's one of them. And I don't think one is necessarily better than the other. You just have to know what you can live with. I cannot live, and I do tell the students, I cannot live with apathy. I cannot speak in a room, that's why I keep looking around at all of you. I cannot speak in a room where someone has completely checked out. I just find it extraordinarily difficult to do, and it makes me feel like a failure as a teacher.
Or texting.
Or texting, right. So I say, the other day I said to them, okay, we'll start eye contact. The other day I said to them, because there were a couple people who brought their phones out, and I brought my phone out, and I said to them, I promise all of you that I will neither text nor answer this phone in class. And I said, I hope all of you think it's ridiculous that I would make that promise to you. Because I hope all of you assume, of course the teacher would not text or answer the phone in class. And I want you to know I actually feel the same way about you. I know that you assume I can't do that because I'm here to teach you. My sense of what you're doing in the classroom is it's equally important that you're here, and when you do, or you text or on the phone, or they don't actually go on the phone, but they are. I feel that same sense of you have broken our agreement, and but again, like I say, I do think that there are some dangers to being someone who really, and I think there's to being someone who's decided not to let anybody check out completely, and I do think that there's some advantages to deciding that you're going to teach the people who are really there to learn. But that is one question you all want to make. Sorry, one decision you all want to make. Or that you will make implicitly, and I recommend making it explicit to yourself. It's helpful. Okay.
Do you think that it's helpful to make that explicit to the students?
Yes, I do. I tell them exactly. I said all your teachers have quirks. One of my quirks is I can't. I need to be interacting with you all, and for you to be attentive is crucial to me. I understand that it seems reasonable to some of you, and it is reasonable in some of the other classes, that as long as you're not bothering anybody, you can sit in the back corner and fall asleep. I understand that you may feel that way, but you should know about me here on the first day that I'm not one of the teachers who can tolerate that. So that's why you make that explicit. I obviously don't think you should make it explicit that it is okay.
So I guess would you just call on someone if they are nodding off, or how do you police that? If people that make a threat.
So I mostly. So I do try to teach in classrooms. I don't have space is the issue too, and then I would say something more. Space will significantly affect your teaching experience. And the students I taught in sex and gender, I will get to your question here, but the students I taught in sex and gender, I met with a couple of them yesterday to talk about this syllabus before I came here, telling them I was going to do this presentation. And one of the things that they reminded me of, we were in a basement room of an old building at IU, only 22 students in that class. It had movable chairs, so we could change the chairs around. We could gather in a circle. But the chairs were movable, so they also all kind of kept collapsing into each other. And it was dark, and it was not a good room. And I found it's very hard to find other rooms. There's one College Arts and Humanities Institute that has a very long seminar table and has wonderful windows. And I asked the director if we could use it. And it was a little bit of a further walk for the students, and so they grumped and groaned and said, and later reported that they thought I was crazy, that we should have to walk further to get to a different room. Why our room was perfectly fine. It completely transformed the dynamic of the class being in that room. So that's my best evidence of how much room is that. So I do as much as I can. I try to be in a room where I actually can in some way back and forth. So I tend to stay in the front, but I will make forays out into the room. And so I don't like to embarrass people. I'm not someone who's saying, Chris, you need to put that phone down or something, or newspapers need to go down, or by calling someone by name and saying that. But I'll just walk back if they're losing a back part of the room, either by calling on someone or walking back and just being right there. So those are various possibilities, and obviously they're very dramatic, depending on your room setup and size. Okay. Any other questions about that kind of context?
Really quickly, I know that student evaluations are important in your reviews as a assistant or in the keeping your job process. There are a lot of students who feel resentful that you are making them engage, or you are giving them too much work to do. How do you balance that?
Well, I do think one way to handle it is the being explicit at the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
I have both adopted and then this last semester, I guess, abandoned the policy of saying there will be a lot of, I always say there will be a lot of reading, but really emphasizing it, for a couple semesters I did say, the one thing that people always complain about in my classes is there's too much reading, so I'm here to tell you there is a lot of reading, and if that's something you're not able to do, then you need to reconsider your enrollment in this class. So being explicit about your expectations up front. There's always a moment in every teaching workshop where someone says, be explicit. And there is a fallacy to that advice, which is it assumes that if you're explicit, then it is heard and understood. Those two things are. So don't assume that because you were explicit, it was heard and understood. Now, then probably you guys have already done these kinds of teaching things. If there are certain things that are extremely important, the way to make sure that they actually absorb whatever it is that you want to make sure they've actually absorbed is you need to make them reproduce it for you in some way, to come the next day to class and say, okay, everybody write down the 3 policies that I said were most important without looking at the syllabus. And then I'll try to write them down, and then they won't know what they were, but they'll have a moment of feeling bad that they don't know what they are, or I'll say I'm going to collect them, and then they'll listen. People are doing this, it's a lot of this idea about why quizzes, for example, are helpful for retention of information. So in terms of policies, you can use something like that to make sure they'll remember. Still, there are lots of reasons why they are enrolled in class, and even if you say, if you're supposed to have your expectations, they may still stay. So, let's see. So the question is, what do you do about how disgruntled they are? I guess the other thing is you really need to be conveying usefulness. If you need to be conveying that it's not punitive, you need to be conveying that it's not for the teacher, that a teacher's whim. You need to be conveying that it's about learning, that it will make it more exciting, and if it doesn't, and if they don't feel the sense of I've learned more today because I was more engaged, because there were lots of questions and people were sort of asked to be attentive, then they will be really frustrated. And in some ways, rightly so. I guess this is to say, in some way, the answer to handling students' unwillingness to do things, like colleagues said recently, I just can't get them to take notes. I can't get them to take notes. I'm sitting in class and I'm telling them important things, and they don't take notes. And I tell them, you need to take notes on this material. You won't remember it unless you do. But they don't know exactly why they need to take notes. And so then I suggested that she create a scenario where they have an experience of listening to something, take no notes, and then being asked to recall it the next class. And then you, subsequent time, have them take notes and then be asked to recall it the next class. If they can experience the difference, they'll be sold on taking notes. If they don't experience the difference, then maybe you were wrong. Maybe they don't need to take notes. So, in other words, that would be a way to be thinking about how to give them the experience of knowing the usefulness of what it is you're asking them to do. And that's, I take very seriously the concern about disgruntled students. Meaning, I know how anxiety-producing that is. And I don't want to minimize that, and in some ways no way around it. And a tough student or a resentful student can derail a class, and that's difficult. And There are a couple other little things you can do. Another thing I highly recommend, midterm evaluations. People say that's a good thing. Certainly it's good for you for feedback. It's also in a kind of very pragmatic, strategic way. It's very good for letting them let off some steam. And that's true too. Those kinds of things are things you might want to keep in mind. But that's the world we're in. You are just dealing with that, and it's difficult and frustrating. And teachers who tell you that it isn't. Well, for many of us it is. Yeah.
How do you, do you make allowances for shy students and people who aren't as accustomed to university environments, like if they don't come from places where their parents went to college and things like that?
Yes, yes, absolutely. And it is true that one of the great things about teaching at a place like Indiana is there is still like some class diversity class in some way. And I once, pretty early on, had a really interesting discussion break out about, it was a discussion about speech codes and speech patterns, and in the course of the discussion, many people brought up the fact that they were first-generation college students and described how they've changed their accents or their vocabulary use after they arrived at college. And that was a great reminder of exactly how many people are first-generation college students. Again, that's fewer than it was, and that will vary, of course, dramatically depending on where you're teaching. Yes, I would say the way in which I make allowances, first of all, of course, you're talking to people and faces, and so you do have a sense of, you get a little bit of a sense of it. Perhaps I would say in my own teaching style, I err a little bit on the side of if you say anything, I can make it work. So I'm not Socratic in the sense that I've asked the question, I'm going to wait till you provided an answer, I'm going to find the next question that challenges your answer, or I'm going to claim something, or I'm going to comment on the adequacy of your answer. That's not what I mean by interactive. I mean that there's a way that if someone can offer something, there's one thing that can be quite useful, and students will often comment on this. If it's a shy student, someone who doesn't feel articulate, has difficulty expressing themselves, first of all to say, and they've just watched me, as you have watched me try to say something and not say it very clearly or eloquently. So I say, that's something we're all trying to do. That's hard. You're right. Let's think about how we can say that. So using we language, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. And then also finding a way to formulate back to them what they've said in the ways in which it can move the conversation forward. And I do definitely consider that when I have a shy student who says something that becomes a framing thing, boy, do I go back and I go back to the person. But as Monica just said, let's think about that thing Monica said. So not that she's no longer on the spot, but what she said has been shown to be in some way something that we all can think with. And the hope is that that's not one of the frustrations I get. I do get frustrations about reading difficulty, but I don't get people saying they were frustrated that I called on them or that they felt they'd been called out or embarrassed in class. So I don't, that's not one of the things I have trouble with. Yeah.
This is kind of related to the previous question. You talked about students who are getting the chance to come in from out of state as a result of testing evaluations, but that the way you were talking about it is sort of a part of the picture, right? And the kind of creative or strategic or outside of the box kind of thinking that you might be looking for might be lacking in students that were taught do this test, ace this test, and then the test is the end. Or this is the telos of your learning. So have you found that to be particularly challenging, or are there sort of strategies for that, or does it become just an organic, growing into creativity process?
Yeah, I find it very challenging. And the biggest challenge is, and you probably can imagine from the way I've been talking, that it intersects with in a way that can be very problematic in my teaching style, which is that I prize question asking, and I'm very, very comfortable with a high level of kind of ambiguity, or I'm interested in thinking with and around questions, and not necessarily great at always being able to say, here are the 3 things you want to take away. Here's the clear outline. I do try to rein myself in a bit by doing things like outlines, which I find Susan uses beautifully, and I find very helpful. But that is working against my instincts a little bit, creating that kind of structure. It's something students deeply want, is that kind of clarity. So what they're experiencing with me in my classrooms is sometimes the pleasure of not everything being nailed down at the end of every session, for example, but I take seriously the frustration of that too. And I think that and I do think also students at IU they're modest even when they're super smart. They don't have a strong sense of, certainly, I don't think I've met an entitled student that I'm sure I have. They're probably mostly other majors, but I think that there's a way that, so it is also true that they are very quiet, so both things, they're quiet, it's culture, it's Midwestern culture still, even with more and more out-of-state and international students, actually many more international students in the last 5 years. But for other reasons, international students are often quiet, and for some of the same reasons and other reasons. So that they're quiet because there's sort of a culture of, don't stick your neck out, don't think you're all that, don't be the one who's trying to wave your hand. And also because they've been trained in a certain way in classrooms where if you don't know the right answer, why would you give any answer? Or why would you give any response? If you don't know the right answer, why would you respond? And so I think that it's a kind of process. I was thinking when I was trying to think about structuring these comments to some degree, that one thing you also want to think about yourself as teachers is what is your tolerance or desire for clarity and what is your tolerance or desire for ambiguity. And again, this is something else where I think very, very, very good teaching gets done on both ends of these spectrums. I think it really should be about you figuring out what brought you into intellectual life, what it is that motivates you as a teacher, what it is that happens in a classroom that makes you feel successful. Like, I've done the thing, I saw them all thinking. Or, today I was lucid. I explained that really complicated idea in a way, and I saw them hear that clarity. If that's your success, then you're kind of on the side, you're a little bit more further along the side of clarity being the thing you put a premium on. If you're someone who's, I just think we were also I just want to be puzzled. At some point they put their heads down like this, and then they then you're a little bit more on the side of ambiguity. You're like, so I think that you want to be, you want to have some sense of that, both in the way you structure your syllabi, the kinds of assignments you do, and which is, I think, maybe now you're getting back around to your kind of question. One way to do it, of course, is in the assignments that you do. So I myself hated being asked to be creative when I was a student. I was actually thinking of the role-playing thing and how, no, I was a student because I didn't do theater. I didn't want to do theater. I wanted to answer questions in a classroom. So I think that there's a way that I just completely lost my train of thought. Creative assignment. So I don't necessarily foreground this need for creativity, though I think that can be an absolutely fabulous way to teach. But I do try to get them to think about connections that aren't obvious, and that's, I guess, my version of playfulness. Yeah. And so, for example, in the Bible's Bodies and Religious Reform, that course I began with the Flannery O'Connor story, which has nothing explicitly to do with the topic. And certainly not in the sense with the third word. The third word, well, here in this version I call it Religious Reform. I go back and forth, but basically it's a Reformation course. And I start with the Flannery O'Connor story. And it's not clear. I was actually, so my other preparation for this was talking to a student who graduated about 8 years ago, and so took an earlier version of this course. And had mentioned to me a couple of times how thought-provoking it had been for him to start with reading. And but he was saying to me yesterday, I said, so, about to give this presentation, what are some thoughts you have now, 7 or 8 years out after having taken that course? He said, if you'd asked me, he loves it, he's returned to it many times, it's been interesting in his way of reading, everything has changed. He said, but if you'd asked me in week 3 why we started with that story, I wouldn't have been able to tell you. he hooked me because it was a little strange. I was hooked by the strangeness and the foreignness of that choice to start there in a religious studies class where we didn't go on to read fiction. You know, it wasn't that we were, in the sense, it's kind of unfair sort of starting point. But the fact that the fact I didn't know on week 3 what it was we were doing with that story, but there was a sense that I was hooked enough to stay engaged through actually some fairly hardcore, actually Reformation kind of ideas and texts and questions. And then I do create a final exam where I do ask them to have a final exam on their options, right, is to go back to that final comic story. This is the H203 final exam page that I sent out to you all. Ask them to go back to that story and reflect on it. Now, I am explicit about why I'm using this. This is the explicit one. I am explicit about why I'm using the Flannery comic story. I tell them, there's a question in this class, this is the question in this class, and this is why this story is appropriate. But they can't hear, there's no way for them to fully grasp that. And of course, because it's a good story, there's the ambiguity built into your interpretation of it. So is that sort of address your questions to some degree?
Yeah, that's very helpful because I think, and it's funny that you said about asking questions and having an answer. Because I was a technical theater director, I had to throw that approach away. I tried it and it just didn't work. The students were like in revolt. But the flexibility of creativity is something that interests me a lot in the pedagogical moment, right? Like, we're not always going to be asking you to write a reflection that's total, has no thesis, has no bearing on, anything other than your opinion or your belief. Right. However, there are ways to be creative in doing argumentative writing or doing argumentative discussion that can yield new things or surprising things.
Right. And I guess I want to say that the best kind of thought, analytic thought of any kind, actually is creative. So when I say what it is to do a creative assignment, I think an assignment that requires you to think in ways you haven't thought before is creative.
In the study of history, though, it often is synthetic thinking that's the most creative.
Is the most what?
Creative.
Creative, exactly. Absolutely. Sorry, I didn't mean to say analytic opposed to synthetic.
Basically, if you're sticking to historical studies and texts and methodology, etc., it is the synthetic thinker who comes up with the most creative.
Absolutely. And that's another way of saying we wrote unexpected connections, putting things together in ways that they weren't, the connections were not already apparent. And I guess, of course, I have a strong investment in that coming to seem exciting and creative. That's what I think it is to convey the excitement of ideas and how ideas matter. So maybe we can turn to the Bible bodies and talk a little bit. I'm, of course, very excited to continue to ask questions, but I don't want you to want to make sure we have a chance to talk about some specifics, since there's a way in which syllabi creation is a significant part of our job. And I've touched on a lot of things, So I think I'll continue to talk in some meta ways about structure and assignments. If you want to ask me about specifics of content, feel free. I don't mean to be de-emphasizing that. But, I think it's so the description is a good example. So we'll start with the description. I spent a lot of time on my descriptions. I do think that you should have an interesting question that structures your class. Now, if you are a student writer, for example, you have a brilliant thesis structure in your class. I do not always have a clear thesis structure in my class. I have a very good question. And that goes to, I think, it's something I say to students in terms of learning to write. Once you the most difficult thing in writing a paper is formulating a good question. Once you've formulated a good question, the answer to that question is a good thesis. And I think that's a helpful way, just as a writing teaching writing, I think that's a helpful way for them to think. And the question you start with, almost by definition, won't be a good question. You'll start with a basic question, kind of like a topic or something. Then you'll learn something about the material, and then you'll have to refine and adapt your question to reflect the knowledge that you've gleaned from your material. As you all know from writing dissertations, that sometimes feels like a daily task. What's my question? What question am I answering here? That's good intellectual work to be doing, right? So I want to frame it as a kind of that there's a question about this material, and frame it in a way that I hope will be intriguing. But again, I don't assume they actually absorb this formulation. And again, that's going to vary dramatically. If you're teaching at if you're teaching in a small liberal arts college, and you've got the students you've got the kinds of students who get excited about reading the course catalog every when the first day comes out, they grab it and they leaf through it and they think of all the possible courses they can take, or the person who's excited to have a syllabus land on their desk. Then you're talking about a certain kind of students, which probably includes everyone in this room. And most of the people that you teach, except maybe in some small liberal arts colleges or certain kind of elite college. So, and it's not because others aren't capable of being as excited about the material. It's because they have so often experienced the classroom as a somewhat oppressive place where a lot goes on that they don't really quite, either know what to do, or that the consequences of failure are so clearly significant. Like in college, they're not full of love anymore. So I do spend some time on this because that's my guide to knowing what I'm trying to do in the class. And of course it is also I'm trying to write it in a way where I'm pulling people in. But again, I want to say I don't think that they necessarily fully understand it. I assume that they fully understand it from the outset. So as I said, when we look at work, I think that what I'm here calling discussion prompts are quite useful. And I did here in this course, change it to reflection papers halfway through so that there would be more extensive reflections rather than just the posts halfway through. Generally, though, I separate out the reflection paper assignment from the discussion prompts and just keep the discussion prompts as a constant throughout. And then I mostly do take-homes and the report. This is a report here on rituals required. I can talk a little bit about presentation requirements and the rubric I hand out for presentations and reports. That's a link to piece of material I have about. As you'll see, this was a balance of primary sources and secondary sources. This class is, and I think that I go back and forth on that. I think that I have taught classes that are almost all primary sources, and I really like doing that a lot. I also feel like there's something wonderful about students having the experience of a secondary of learning, of watching someone grapple with a primary source and reading that. So that's the usefulness of secondary sources. In other words, I don't usually bring in secondary sources just for coverage. Wouldn't be a reason to do it. Yeah.
Is that true even of intro to Christianity, or no, even better, intro to world religions? If IU has a kind of thing.
We do intro to religion. I teach that, and I also teach intro to Christianity. I have taught intro to Christianity. I've been teaching intro to religion more recently.
So what you take on textbooks?
I don't do that.
I don't want to, but I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's an important question. I have done various things with intro to Christianity. It does. If you can find a great textbook, I think absolutely use it. I just find that you can convey. There's a way in which the sort of flood of information is for some students really, really reassuring and helpful. For many students, it's daunting, and I honestly feel that way when I read a textbook too. I'm a little overwhelmed by the kind of flood of information. Literally, almost at a format level. It's just they are big, and there's a lot going on. I know that now it's even, for me, it's harder now because they're all divided up with all the pictures and little boxes. I'm too old for that. And in some way, that they don't tend to be thesis driven. So it's a little bit difficult. So if you find one that is thesis driven, then there's a way in which that formulation can engage students. And also then an intro to Christianity. For example, Mary Jo Weaver wrote a textbook based on her intro to Christianity class that she taught at Indiana University, and I did use that the first couple of times. But then what I think is very good about her textbook, it's really her take on it, and it's not my take. So I'm kind of working against it a little bit. The way she presents certain things isn't the way I would present those things. So if it was neutral enough that I didn't have to worry about that, well, then it's all too neutral. And if it's opinionated enough, it still looms too large. It's like my face and then the textbook, right? We're sort of vying for authority a little bit.
But do you find that any students miss just the sense of structure?
Yes, absolutely.
So you have to work to fill that in?
Yes, and I do, my intro to Christianity classes especially, I do So for the last time I taught it, I used Augustine's Confession as my framing device. And I thought about Christianity as the kind of the question of the seeker. I started with thinking about Augustine in relation to Into the Wild. Is that the guy goes off to? The seeker, and trying to start with them thinking about what it means to be a seeker and examples they have of seekers and those sorts of things. And then I do actually, I'm fairly chronological in the way I end up presenting it, but in the chronology, I pick out certain themes that I have highlighted in the initial presentation of Augustine's Confession. I don't have them, for example, read the whole of it to give you a sense of reading levels. I mean, reading mode. But in that class, I do always put an outline up on the board. I use PowerPoint as mostly I use PowerPoint as a kind of projection device, so I do put an outline up there, and I provide structure that way. I could have recommended textbook for people who really are self-starters and really love the textbook reading. I have almost no one taking up on that, but that is definitely.
You're saying every class you would get an outline of like the structure of this class?
Yeah, every session. Okay. Every session, there's an outline.
Yeah. Okay.
That's more true in Intro to Christianity than any other course in class. It's going to teach Intro to Religion is a much more intro to thinking about religion rather than a coverage. It's not a world religions class. If I did it as a world religions class, which I wouldn't, but if I did, I probably would think about something like an outline up at the front too. And you do want to think always in terms of, well, yes, so textbooks. Again, that's a helpful, that goes to the point about clarity, too. How comfortable or uncomfortable are you with students' confusion? And I tend to feel it can be generative for me. I get when students are really confused, it is for me a problem I need to kind of deal with, and that for me is that invites the kind of teaching I like, the kind of thinking I like to do that makes teaching interesting for me. But for some of you, that just is a lot of anxiety you do not need to deal with. And that's great. Just know that about yourself and use a textbook and don't deal with that anxiety. It's not generative or productive for you. Yeah.
One of the things about textbooks is that it gives a message to the class. This is a memorization. You memorize that chapter and move on.
That's a nice way to put it.
And sometimes that's what you have to do. I'm in chemistry, that's what I had to do. But I mean, if you're interpreting text, it can get in the way.
And if you're interpreting text, one of the things you're doing is teaching the text need to be interpreted. And a textbook is telling them the text don't need to be interpreted. Someone a lot smarter than you just did it. Spent 3 years doing it for you. So you don't have to do it.
So what you do with textbooks, I mean, I recommend if something comes up in these guys.
Exactly.
But it does give a message.
It absolutely. And that is a really, really important thing for you all to know, that every choice you make about the readings sends a message to students about what kind of course it is. So that's another way in which actually being explicit, you're not necessarily explicit about that, but they will pick up on that.
Well, yeah, just to kind of that conversation, like my hesitation in the idea of designing a textbook would just be like, assuming that most of the students are accustomed to that kind of reading from high school, it's like, well, you're in college now. We don't have to have this kind of, you want to be reading and producing like argumentative or interpretive course, and like that's how your thinking is going to be different.
I think that's a great point. I have a 17-year-old daughter, and she's reading textbooks right now, happily every night with the kitchen island. And I don't have, so I have, a daily experience of the frustrations of how she's not being excited about American history. She's been experiencing it. I think a very good textbook. It's got lots of great materials and all that, but there's something definitely, like I said, about the heft and the monumental nature. But I think what you also brought up is a really important point. It's easy for us, when we think about students who are disengaged, it's easy for us to think about the problems, the kind of difficulty we have in dealing with the students because they've been their teachers teach the test, or they are disengaged, or they're just taking it because it's a requirement, or they want to have more clarity, they want to just know what they have to do and get in, get out. We can often I just discovered this a couple of weeks ago in my class, when they were unexpected. They were much more prepared for something, much more willing to do something difficult than I had realized they would be. The discussion about a difficult text was much better than a discussion about a much easier text the week earlier. And it reminded me of the times when they will say things like, wait, I don't want to be. This isn't supposed to be like high school. So there is a way to be I think there's a danger in underestimating our students. And so and also I just think for your own sanity and happiness, I think it's generally given the two options of assuming the students are just a series of problems you gotta solve, or assuming the students are probably people who are there in a way that you can engage with them and do something significant and important to them, and they would like to be challenged. Probably better to go with the second assumption. Realistic. I mean, don't be a total idealist. You want to be realistic about that. You want to be pragmatic. But I find that it's better to aim high rather than aim low, and I think they tend to rise to the occasion.
Can I ask a question on the textbook issue? That as an historian in particular, not only religious illiteracy, but historical, geographical, the stuffness of
where is Asia?
300, 1600 are the same.
And so one of the things that a textbook often is used is to give this sort of survey background. But of course the problem is that all the methodologies, and all the decision points made about what's background and what's foreground have been made in this textbook. So handing it over is sort of saying, here it is, easy.
Right.
I mean, I tend to give timelines, and
yes.
I give about
timelines are very helpful.
But I give 6 different ones, so people can see that like Peter Brown has a great one for late antiquity that says significant events are marked with an asterisk, and I just love that, right? Like how do you decide? You said they're significant. What about this? But that does indeed. It means that students themselves have to grapple with if and how there's a narrative to be constructed, and by whom from those parts. And you have to decide that some things are just, you have to know.
Yes.
So how do you get the you have to know stuff
right,
along with the need for them to think with?
I think a good example of how I do that is the way I structure, for example, medieval Christianity. The key thing I didn't tell you all about my context is, so I'm the only person who teaches anything on Christianity from late antiquity up through the Americanists, and the Americanists don't go back, especially as far. So 18th century Americans, not even Europe. So that will not change. We're not going to hire a legalist, I don't think, in time in the report. So, and the people in the history department, as it turns out, aren't very interested in religion. So anyway, for various reasons, I teach a medieval Christianity class. Also, actually, on the job description. They said, let's be prepared to teach a course from 400 to 1500, and another course from 1500 to the present. Christianity. The way I do the medieval Christianity class is the question is authority, and I have 3 different kinds of authority that I look at: institutional, charismatic, and intellectual. And I go through the same timeline 3 times. So I say timeline is like a horizontal coat rack, and you cannot learn anything unless you have hooks to hang it off of. And so imagine yourself, I'm giving you this timeline as your horizontal coat rack, and when you aren't learning something, it's not your fault. You're not an idiot. It's not your fault. It's because you have nothing to hang it off. You have nothing to hang it off of. So the reason why I said I'm not a man of dates, I'm not actually good at remembering dates. You will find me fumbling over certain dates at certain moments in this class. But I'm giving you this coat rack anyway, and I'm saying you should learn it. You won't, like I said, the specific date, sometimes you won't remember exactly, but you've got to remember the sequential. And the crucial thing about it is that it is sequential, so it gives you a structuring, gives you a structure. And then we're going to go through and talk about this sort of swath of history. With one sort of set of themes in mind, and so certain figures are going to show up. Augustine shows up in every one. Good. We took an extraordinary Augustine class. This is Schreiner, my first year of graduate school, and he just looms large for me all the time. But some people don't come up in the charismatic authorities where we do, for example, women, and we don't do that. When we do it, we touch on that in terms of institutional authority. And we do Eloise in intellectual authority, but we generally the question of gender and women's roles comes up more in the section, charismatic, for example. So then I say you're going to get 3 chances at this timeline, which I think is the same, very similar to you giving them 6. You're you're sort of giving the same kind of lesson of structure, but also complicating the structure in a way. Okay, so here we are on the second page now, Bibles and bodies. And I guess I had mentioned already this. I do highly recommend, I didn't do as well in this syllabus as I should have. I think it's useful for you to create headings for sections of the course. Again, like the description, it tells you, if not them, what you're doing in that section of the course. It's a kind of structured guideline and you will have a moment, and you will all be overwhelmed at various moments in the semester for various reasons, because things aren't going well in the class, or just because you're being asked to, you have to get a conference paper done, and you don't have time to spend thinking about class, and you will be overwhelmed, and you'll look down and think, what's my question? Like, what am I doing here? And you'll see. Now, if I still listen, I thought this through. It's okay. And I kind of know what I'm doing for the next 2 weeks and why I'm doing it. I think you will have the experience that I often have. There's one, it seems to me there's almost one brain working when you choose your readings, and it's your brain. And then when you reread the readings in preparation for class, you're all of a sudden reading it with their brains, and you think, what was I thinking? Like, what did I imagine they were going to be able to read here? 2 strategies for handling that. Of course, that's useful because that means you're preparing to go into the class and think about where they actually are. I highly recommend reading questions. I think they are. It's another structuring thing I do to correct my own sense of high tolerance for ambiguity. So reading questions, I do reading questions, and they also have to do the posts. Those things are. So the post, as I mentioned, is them showing themselves and me that they engage the text before they walk into class. The reading questions give them some sense of material that specifically will be covered in class, and it allows me to be someone who cold calls. In other words, here's your reading questions, come prepared, these are questions that I will expect you thought about before class. In many cases, I'll recommend that you, if you're the kind of student who isn't comfortable just remembering your answer, you're going to want to have written down some notes to yourself about your answers to that. And as I say in one of these syllabi, sometimes I will say, and if there's a problem with class participation, I will start to make a practice of picking them up if it seems that nobody's preparing for before class. So reading questions I think are helpful, and section headings are helpful for making keeping you honest to yourself about what it is you're trying to do in that section, and it allows you to be prepared for their confusion about why it is that you're reading what you're reading, which seems so fabulous in July and seems a little stranger here in October when you're actually trying to teach it. So let's see. The other things I do think are quite helpful to do is this is the one class, I guess, but I do really like it. I should figure out other ways to do it in other classes. This ritual paper is something that requires them to do some out-of-class, to go to some kind of ritual and then report on it. So I think that in this class, I generally also do a couple of field trips to religious rituals of one kind or another, and those are labor-intensive. That's going to vary depending on, which is to say, me giving up a half Sunday or Saturday or Friday night or whatever, and it, I think you should feel comfortable, like I said, putting some boundaries around the amount of work you ask of yourself. So I say field trips are great, they're wonderful. That doesn't mean you should then store in your head, I should be a teacher. I'm someone who should always be figuring out ways to do out-of-class things with your students. Because in some cases, in some situations, that just may be more than you should ask of yourself. But in any case, so we do field trips, and they have to write a paper about the ritual and that's one of the ways I try to make sure that it's linked up. That they see how they have already in some way grappled with the questions in the course, and then hopefully have more vocabulary and concepts for thinking about. They have one of those aha moments. Boy, I was in a ritual like this once, and I wasn't thinking anything. And now, after having read these 5 things, I'm in this experience, and I'm thinking, oh, but look how look how highly formalized it is, or it isn't very formalized, for example. those kinds of things can be really helpful for them in seeing the usefulness of what they're doing and the ideas, and they come back very excited about that. I also, maybe another thing to say about the specific, or about the meta version of the structuring of the course, another choice you have to make is how substantial to make your syllabus. There is a syllabus, I would say, syllabi, certainly in my experience, I don't know if this is true here, have gotten longer and longer and longer and longer over the course of my time in academia as we go back over to student. I am not a fan of a long syllabus that spells out absolutely everything. Again, I think it's a little bit like the textbook. If you try to spell out everything and answer to every question you have, they will have, if you're trying to anticipate and answer every question they have in the syllabus, you will set yourself up for the frustration of the day that they write you and say, oh, wait, what was the due date for? But didn't you read the syllabus? So, it sets you up for the frustration. They won't pour over it with the same care and attention you spent creating it. And B, it suggests that everything can be covered even if it's not covered. Now, I know that there are some institutions which will just say, they will say to you, the syllabus is a legal document, and these are the things you have to put in the syllabus. I don't teach at one of those institutions, so I'm now inclined, in my syllabi, I'm actually starting to get shorter again rather than longer. And I do think, again, that is an important thing. You're signaling to your students, is it an adversarial contractual relationship that we're setting up here? Or is it a kind of learning relationship that we're setting up here? And if it's an adversarial contractual relationship, then absolutely, you have to spell out every contingency and every requirement. Really. If it's a relationship, learning relationship, then you have to give some clarity, because that's just unfair to ask people to be part of a relationship where they don't understand what the parameters of it are. But you don't have to think about yourself as a kind of legal person. But in this case, so I put 10, for example, my policies here are longer, I think, than they are in more recent syllabi. And any questions about any of that kind of thing? Let's look at the other course syllabus.
Yes, one thing that we should be aware of here is that most schools are not on quarter system.
Oh, yes, thank you. That's a very, because I teach at a place, there is no place in the United States that has a longer semester than 16 weeks. 16 weeks, yes, 16 weeks. There are other places that have 16-week semesters, but it is a brutal thing. Now, I think a quarter system is very short, so I appreciate 12 weeks. Everybody should just be 12 weeks.
13 is right. But quarter systems have their real fallback, because you really are not able to do as much as you are in a normal sort of.
Yes. And so that's a very important thing. You all talked about in other contexts that difference between making the adjustment from the quarter system to a semester system. And one thing about that adjustment is that your first thought will be, this is so great, I can get so much in, because it's longer. And that's probably not the best way to be thinking about it, because what you're not doing, if you're thinking about it that way, is you're not thinking about the ebb and flow of a long semester, both in your own energy, but certainly in the student energy. So I'm here beginning of our spring break, and one of the difficulties of the spring semester is that we come back after spring break, and there are actually still 7 to 8 weeks when we count finals left. So everyone comes back with the momentum of we're in the final stretch. But that is, as you know, it's almost a quarter. It's a really long final stretch. And the weather gets really nice. In Indiana, we have this race called Little Five, which is known as the biggest party weekend in the country by some people. And that comes 3 weeks before finals. So you're really struggling with some things in terms of, you want to have those kinds of things in mind when you think about your assignments. You also want to think, one thing I did adopt pretty early on is you want to have some sort of graded thing early in the semester. I would say within the first 5 to 6 weeks, 6 weeks at the outside, so that they get a sense of you and how you grade things. Again, as I say, I've been doing these postings all along, but I'm not doing real grading of those. So you want either a midterm or a paper already by 6 weeks. I also more recently have realized the value of front-loading. 2 things are great about front-loading. Make the course very difficult at the beginning. One is it does convey what the expectations are. 2 is you get their attention. If everybody else is ramping up slowly, your course looms larger in their mind. And it's true, it's competition. And if you're taking religious studies, you might already start a little bit at a deficit in terms of what's going to compel their attention. But also then it gives you the leeway if you think about it that way and you say it to them. This, and I will talk about the workload in those terms. So I'll say, for example, this course starts off there's a lot of work at the beginning. Some of them are all mentioned. I'll say where the hardest reading is going to be. You're doing a really hard 3 weeks, super difficult. You're going to be all right, but it's going to be hard. But then you're giving yourself some leeway to have it taper off a little bit at the end with things like them writing a longer paper, things where it's more focused on what they're doing. This is all thought out. But in any case, you have to think about it more with the long semester. And you may have been in your own education or in other institutions, the midterm that comes midway through the semester, and I'll just say for a long semester, I think that is too late to do a midterm. I think it's better to take a sort of dividing it up into threes, and that's what I generally do. And most people now generally do it. It's actually interesting how that's really trying to change the assumption. Okay, yeah.
Do you give them a rubric for reflection paper? I mean, the one time I did that, some students, I couldn't get them past very, very first person reflections, which I'm fine with some first person. But anyway, how do you negotiate that? Do you have a problem with that at all?
So I do tell them they can use I, and
I don't mean so much that, but just like, here's what I feel about the reading versus engaging with some point.
Yeah, so I talked about reflection papers being a building on what they've been doing in the postings. Okay. So, for example, you have to be engaging the text in a very specific way, and what you talk about, and this goes back to this I think you said it was a Carolyn Walker Bynum exegetical paper assignment that Susan...
Which you cannot do on a quarter system. That is to prove your point. Okay. That you have to realize what you can grade in 9 or 10 weeks and what you can't. And I always had that in a semester system.
Okay, but you did actually make us do it in the Augustine
Fine. The more meetings you have, or the larger the class, it's hard to do that. But
So I think reflection paper, so what you've already built in with the postings a little bit, and then what I do sometimes make explicit in what I call exegetical paper assignments, I think I gave a description in the class, is the exegetical paper, right? So that's on page 4 of the substantive class. So is that they've already got some experience, they have to be text-based, and they are supposed to be engaging the text. But the exegetical paper is presented as something that they don't have to create a thesis. So they aren't being asked to do a reflection paper in that sense. But I think in terms of Joy, just staying with the question you asked about the actual reflection paper assignment rather than this exegetical paper assignment, which we can talk about next. With reflection paper, in this Bible Body class, for example, they also posted those on forums. So it was in terms of its format, in terms of their experience of the medium, it felt like an extension of the postings as well. And I was just looking back through them on course, and they were great. Their reflection papers were really great. And now I use blogs in my courses, in small courses I've been using blogs more. But there's a way in which it's clear that they have an audience that they're communicating to. And if you have a sense that you're trying to communicate to an audience rather than meet a series of requirements for a series of guidelines laid out by a professor who's very different, wants very different things than my psychology professor does, that's always very frustrating. I know we've all experienced when people say that kind of thing, because I think probably most professors don't want very different things. But students just feel like every class is a mystery box, and they walk in, they open up the box, and that professor pops out and asks something like that, but they never get asked some other. So if you create a scenario, one way is various ways. Blogs, one way I try to do it, having them post the reflection papers on forums where other students can read them, even if other students don't read them. Those kinds of things convey that you're writing for an audience. And then they tend, at least, I was actually pretty impressed with their papers.
Do you ask the other students to read them and then maybe they don't?
I don't. I should do more of that. And I think I was going on talking briefly about talking briefly about the blogs that I'm doing in another course right now. And the blogs, I assumed everybody's reading because blogs. I don't blog. I'm not in the blogosphere, and yet I assumed when I thought I was being so up to date by asking them to read blogs, and I assumed, well, anybody aren't they online all the time? If there's blogs on the course, won't they just be reading them all the time? No. So I realized that on week 6, and I realized one of the things that was hindering the kind of the class wasn't quite gelling in the way that I thought it should. It's a major seminar, a small major seminar I'm teaching right now, and they're really some of the best. So they're the smartest group of students, across the board, high quality, engaged students. There's something that wasn't working about the class dynamic, and I realized part of it was that they weren't reading each other's reflection, and so I instituted, you have to respond to somebody else's blog, in your blog, or to a comment that's made in class, and it's really significantly changed the class dynamic, and blogs are great, because the blogs are better, because they're trying to communicate what you said, but I actually think if you look on page 33, it says, but I know you've quoted that thing from page 77, but actually, they don't, it's exciting to watch that. So I should have done more of that, and that was a mistake. Yeah.
I have a question actually on strategy for timing of, like after spring break. Do you put something really exciting, like satanic sex? Or do you do something kind of easy into? Well, no, these are both false syllabi. But this is right after Thanksgiving break is when you
no, that's a good point. One should, absolutely. I don't think I tend to be, you're juggling so many things that I didn't. I'm trying to think of the courses, I'm trying to think what we're reading right after. So for example, in my original sing class, my large class, right after spring break, I had someone coming in to do a guest lecture. So that, his date for the guest lecture trumped my thinking about what was the most exciting topic would be, for example. So, no, I don't. I think it would be great. But you will be juggling a lot of things when you're trying to figure out which week to put which topic. So, there's only so much leeway you have for trying to work on that. But I am sort of dreading already that he's coming in on Thursday. The stuff I have to do on Tuesday. I will try to think a lot about how to make it exciting. Yeah.
Before when you were talking about blogs, I was just wondering how that's different from these kind of on-course sort of conversations. Are you encouraging them to engage with the public or be a voice to the public in some sort of way?
I should be, absolutely, and I haven't done that. Okay. It is true that that's sort of what was in the back of my mind when I thought blogs instead of on-course. So in the course, for example, I'm describing right now where they have blogging, they do still have to post on on-course before class, and then they have to blog by Friday, so they can choose to blog on anything each week. And I think it would be really, actually I should say, blog, you guys should know this, maybe you already know his name, Mark Sample, who does teaching things at, I think he was at Washington, or American University. Anyway, he's the one who I use, and I credit him, right, because I think he read that syllabus, but I credit him. He's somebody who's developed the blog assignment that I use. And I highly recommend checking him out because the assignment that he uses, also called the blog audit assignment, is one of the most successful assignments I have done. And apologies for not having given you that. But the blog audit assignment is an assignment that asks them to reflect on, after 5 blogs, after 6 weeks, to go back, print out all their blogs, and reflect on the blogs and ask a series of specific questions about what themes did you find yourself engaging, what kinds of text did you, what part of the text or what kinds of questions in the text did you focus on, what did you notice? It's better and more specific, and I'm happy to share that and direct you an example. The assignment's more specific, but that they uniformly describe that as a really valuable reading experience, which is a really valuable assignment, which is a good reminder of how, if you can find ways to build in a chance for them to reflect on what they learned, it's very, very valuable. And that's why all the assignments are the most successful I've found. I do think the final assignment I do for the Bible and Body, the final exam that I did for Bible and Body, did have some of those same experiences because we were revisiting some of the same issues at the end with a whole new set of sort of theoretical tools. So it wasn't asking them to comment on their own writing in the same way, but it certainly was asking them to think about, reflect on material they'd already reflected on once and experience, hopefully, how much more they could do with it here at the end of the course than they were able to do at the beginning. So there's a kind of mental trying to do this.
I think we maybe have time for one more question. Well, I just wanted to ask, if I don't want to step out for a second. I re-entered the room when you were saying about the syllabus being not, it sets up a kind of a relationship, and it can either be sort of adversarial, contractual, or relational. And I really agree with that a lot. And I wonder what you think about course goals as an instrument on syllabi. I noticed that you don't have them. You've talked a lot about ways that you establish those goals and norms. You prefer to do that orally than in writing, or how do you think about that?
My choice on that's going to be, I won't have a choice within a year or two. We're going to be required to put course goals on our syllabi because of an assessment process or accreditation process. That was something that was identified as something that Indiana University wasn't doing enough of clarity. So we're going through a whole departmental process of deciding what our departmental goals are and how learning outcomes can be specified. I do in some of my work, it is interesting, I didn't do it in sex and gender. I guess I do it in my large introductory courses. I think I listed, in the last couple of years I have listed them. I think that they are, again, I'm excited about the process we're going through in our department. It has been very useful. The brainstorming, going through the process of thinking about how we would link goals to learning outcomes. That has been great, and we've been trying very hard to make sure that it is for us an intellectually, pedagogically meaningful exercise. And in that sense, I think its usefulness is like the usefulness of writing a really good course description. I don't think it is pedagogically effective to list your course goals. In other words, I don't think that listing them makes it possible for students to learn them. In other words, so the listing of them is in that sense irrelevant. But in another sense, it's quite useful, of course, to have some clarity about it, to formulate your ideas about it. And it does convey to students, it goes to the usefulness point. But again, this is like the rubric. I think it's akin to a question about rubrics, which is something we go back and forth about. And I think there's a spectrum of ways to think about rubrics, for example. And that spectrum is, on the one hand, clarity of expectations. Useful. Absolutely useful. We all know how hard it is to be in a situation where you don't know what's being asked of you. Why does the person focus on this in their grading? I have no idea. Rubrics can, if written clearly in prose form, I think, give a good sense of that kind of thing. By themselves, I don't think they are pedagogically effective, but I do think that they have to be used. The other end of the extreme with rubrics is we are going to be so specific about everything that makes up a good paper that we're entering into the world where computers can grade grading. We all know, right, about computers, this debates about the efficacy of computers grading. But if you convey to students that it really is a paint by numbers thing, if you do these 20 things, you will get an A, and if you do only 18 of them, you'll get an A minus, and if you do only 16 of them, then you have absolutely given away the game. Like, you have absolutely decided, essentially, that that's what you think paper writing involves. And that's not what paper writing involves. Paper writing involves thinking hard about difficult things in conversation with material that's probably unfamiliar to you. And it requires a lot of thought and a lot of time. And that's what you need to convey, and it's difficult. And that's what you want to be. And the reason it feels hard is because you're working hard, and that's great. And the reason I'm grading you is because it's good to have a kind of response where you can have a sense like coaching, where someone can say to you, here's what you did and here's what you didn't do. That is a satisfying interaction. We all like having those kinds of interactions in life. So if you can think about grading and present grading as more like that than a list of check marks, then I think you're in the right place with rubrics. And if you're,
Well, I just want to say this has been a stellar session in every way, both in terms of the way you taught it and just the array of things that we talked about good pedagogy today, in addition to how it came out on paper. So we're so grateful that you were part of your break. It starts now. So everyone, please.
We thank you for listening to or viewing our podcast. For more information and for other podcasts, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts. Copyright, the University of Chicago Divinity School.